Hello, 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 everyone. My name is John Sierra, and I'm a Tolkien scholar. And what that means is that I'm, generally speaking, the guy that you can go to and ask any sort of question about the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, whether it's The Hobbit, or The Lord of the Rings, or The Silmarillion, or Unfinished Tales, or any of his other works. I've been studying it for a very long time, and it's been a bit of a hyperfixation for me for my entire life. So if you want to ask a question, there are several ways that you can do so. Well, really, there's two main ways, I suppose. The main way that you can do it is to just post a question on this very video. I do read all the comments. I try to respond to as many of them as I can. I try to at least sit down 2 or 3 times a week and answer questions from YouTube. But if you want to be featured in a video, then you go to Quora. Now, Quora is a website where you can ask any sort of question that that comes to your mind and have people with relevant experience and knowledge answer it, and also completely random people. But the thing is, when you ask a question on Quora, it detects what you're asking about, and it will give you a list of people that Quora feels are experts, so to speak. I don't like the word expert, but that's the word that they sort of use. Very knowledgeable people in that field. And if you ask any sort of Tolkien question on there, you're going to get a list of people, and my name is going to be on or at the very top of that list. So, of course, there's also a link directly to my Quora account in the description of this video. My name is John Sierra on there as well, because that's my name everywhere. That's my name. So, yeah, we're going to get to your questions. We have, I believe, something like 14 questions today. Last week, we didn't have very many because I had some issues with losing power, and I didn't get to write as much, and it was just a whole thing. But we're good now. We're back on track. Although I found that, because I was trying to make the video basically the same length that it usually is. I didn't want to upload something that was like incredibly short, that I spent a little bit more time talking about each question. And I kind of like doing that. So I don't know, maybe the video winds up extra long today. Just to give you guys a quick update on where we're at channel-wise, let's see. Let me bring up the dashboard here. I should have had it up already, but we're at 1,899 subscribers. Next person that subscribes is going to be number 1,900, and then 2,000 is right around the corner there. So that's really great. I'm just really, really happy with that. And I want to talk a little bit about Quora, actually, because the first question is going to be an unusual one. Usually I have questions that are submitted by real people. And I almost always say the name of the person that submitted the questions, although some people are doing it anonymously, and that's fine as well. But there's almost always a person behind the questions that I answer here on the YouTube channel. But the very first question that I'm going to answer was actually not asked by a person, but asked by Quora itself, because they have something that they call the prompt generator. And I've actually been working with some of the people over at Quora to try and improve the prompt generator, because it asks complete nonsense. Like if I should make a top 10 list at one day of the craziest prompts that it has come up with about, like, the Lord of the Rings, because it'll put characters together that never met each other, or it'll ask why an event happened that never happened, or that sort of thing. So I've been giving them a lot of feedback, and they've been very receptive to it about improving it. And I have one here that is going to be our first question that is actually pretty insightful for a prompt. It's still based off of sort of a misconception, but sometimes, these bad questions, they do give you something to talk about. Sometimes I'll see a question and I'll be like, that's a ridiculous question, but it gives me something to talk about. So, there's that as well. Anyway, we're going to get to our reading, and I've chose to read to you today from The Return of the King, specifically the Appendix A, Part 5, which is, here follows a part of the tale of Aragorn and Arwen. What's interesting is there must have been about 10 episodes this is episode 86, and there must have been about 10 or so episodes that I've done where I've decided that I was going to read from the tale of Aragorn and Arwen, and I sit down and then I decide at the last minute that I'm not going to do it, and I'm going to read from some other location. I get a better idea, or perhaps from something that is more relevant to a question that I'm answering, or something like that. But I decided it's time to finally bite the bullet and read you guys a little bit of the tale, or I'm sorry, here follows a part of the tale of Aragorn and Arwen. The backstory behind this is that there were 3 stories that were written for The Lord of the Rings that did not make it into the actual text. There was the tale of Aragorn and Arwen, which we get an excerpt of in the appendix. There was the Hunt for the Ring, and there was the Quest for Erebor. And 2 of those, the Quest for Erebor and the Hunt for the Ring, are basically completed, although there are sort of different versions, and they were put into Unfinished Tales, and I've talked about those in the past. This one, I don't think it was ever finished. I think this excerpt is all that there is to it. The idea is that after the events of The Lord of the Rings, many years after, as a matter of fact, Faramir's grandson would write this story, and it would be added to a special copy of the Red Book of Westmarch called the Thane's Copy. So I'm going to read you. I actually think that since it's so short, maybe we can do the whole thing? Well, maybe not. We'll see how I'm feeling. I'll try to get through it. Arador was the grandfather of the king. His son Arathorn sought in marriage Gilrain the Fair, daughter of Dirhale, who was himself a descendant of Anarath. To this marriage Dirhal was opposed, for Gilrain was young and had not reached the age at which the women of the Dunedain were accustomed to marry. Moreover, he said, Arathorn is a stern man of full age, and will be chieftain sooner than men looked for, yet my heart forebodes that he will be short-lived. But Evorwen, his wife, who was also foresighted, answered, the more need of haste. The days are darkening before the storm, and great things are to come. If these 2 wed now, hope may be born for our people, but if they delay, it will not come while this age lasts. And it happened that when Arathorn and Gilrain had been married only 1 year, Arador was taken by hill trolls in the cold fells north of Rivendell and was slain. And Arathorn became chieftain of the Dunedain. The next year Gilrain bore him a son, and he was called Aragorn. But Aragorn was only 2 years old when Arathorn went riding against the Orcs with the sons of Elrond, and he was slain by an orc arrow that pierced his eye. And so he proved indeed short-lived for one of his race, being but 60 years old when he fell. Then Aragorn, being now the heir of Isildur, was taken with his mother to dwell in the house of Elrond. And Elrond took the place of his father, and came to love him as a son of his own. But he was called Estel, that is hope. And his true name and lineage were kept secret at the bidding of Elrond. For the wise then knew that the enemy was seeking to discover the heir of Isildur, if any remained upon earth. But when Estel was only 20 years of age, it chanced that he returned to Rivendell after great deeds in the company of the sons of Elrond. And Elrond looked at him, and was pleased, for he saw that he was fair and noble, and was early come to manhood, though he would yet become greater in body and in mind. That day therefore Elrond called him by his true name, and told him who he was and whose son, and he delivered to him the heirlooms of his house. Here is the ring of Barahir, he said, the token of your kinship from afar, and here also are the shards of Narsil. With these you may yet do great deeds, for I foretell that the span of your life shall be greater than the measure of men, unless evil befalls you or you fail at the test. But the test will be hard and long. The scepter of Anominus I withhold, for you have yet to earn it. The next day, at the hour of sunset, Aragorn walked alone in the woods, and his heart was high within him, and he sang, for he was full of hope, and the world was fair. And suddenly, even as he sang, he saw a maiden walking in a green sward among the white stems of the birches. And he halted amazed, thinking that he had strayed into a dream, or else that he had received the gift of the elf minstrels, who can make the things of which they sing appear before the eyes of those that listen. For Aragorn had been singing a part of the Lay of Luthien, which tells of the meeting of Luthien and Beren in the forest of Neldareth. And behold, there Luthien walked before his eyes in Rivendell, clad in a mantle of silver and blue, fair as the twilight in Elvenholm, her dark hair stayed by a sudden wind, and her brows were bound with gems like stars. For a moment Aragorn gazed in silence, but fearing that she would pass away and never be seen again, he called to her, crying, Tinuviel, Tinuviel, even as Beren had done in the elder days long ago. Then the maiden turned to him and smiled, and she said, Who are you, and why do you call me by that name? And he answered, Because I believed you to be indeed Luthien Tinuviel, of whom I was singing. And if you are not she, then you walk in her likeness. So many have said, she answered gravely, yet her name is not mine, though maybe my doom will not be unlike hers. But who are you? Estel I was called, he said, but I am Aragorn, Arathorn's son, Isildur's heir, lord of the Dunedain. Yet even in the saying he felt that this high lineage, in which his heart had rejoiced, was now of little worth, and as nothing compared to her dignity and loveliness. But she laughed merrily and said, Then we are akin from afar, for I am Arwen, Elrond's daughter, and I am named also Undomiel. Often is it seen, said Aragorn, that in dangerous days men hide their chief treasure. Yet I marvel at Elrond and your brothers, for though I have dwelt in this house from childhood, I have heard no word of you. How comes it that we have never met before? Surely your father has not kept you locked in his hoard. No, she said, and looked up at the mountains that rose in the east. I have dwelt for a time in the land of my mother's kin, in far Lothlorien, but I have but lately returned to visit my father again. It is many years since I walked in Imladris. Then Aragorn wondered, for she had seemed of no greater age than he, who had lived yet no more than a score of years in Middle-earth. But Arwen looked in his eyes and said, Do not wonder, for the children of Elrond have the life of the Eldar. Then Aragorn was abashed, for he saw the elven light in her eyes and the wisdom of many days. Yet from that hour he loved Arwen Undomiel, daughter of Elrond. Yeah, I think I will stop here. There's not a lot to it. It's not a very long story. It pretty much catches you up with The Lord of the Rings. Oh, actually... Well, then it goes into the House of Eorl. So, yeah, there's about 3 more pages, but... Oh, see, a little more than that, actually. But it's a really interesting story that was, like, sort of meant to supplement The Lord of the Rings. I don't know if Tolkien ever actually wanted this to be a part of the main text. Whereas, the quest for Erebor was almost certainly written to be added to the main text, but then there were deadlines, of course, and it was about to be published. And the quest for the ring also seems like it may have been intended to be part of the main text of The Lord of the Rings. A lot of what I thought as I was reading it, I could explain that, and then it was actually explained like Estel, meaning hope. But it's interesting if we go back to sort of the prophecy about the marriage of Aragorn's father Arathorn to Aragorn's mother Gilrain. And this involves his grandparents, actually, especially his Durhale, who was his grandmother, and of course Arador, his grandfather. And Durhale is opposed to it partly because Gilrain is young compared to him. He's pushing 60, of course, but he's of the Dunedain, so he lives for a long time. But Arador says, moreover, oh no, I'm sorry, that's not it. Evorwen was the grandmother, I'm sorry. She said, the more need of haste, the days of darkening before the storm, and great things are to come. If these two wed now, hope may be born. And of course, the baby that is born, they give the name Hope, Estel, meaning hope, in Sindarin. So it's sort of interesting how that was prophesied. And of course, it's just cute that Aragorn is singing a bit of the Lay of Luthien, also known as the Lay of Leithian, which is the tale of Beren and Luthien, and then he sees Arwen in a vision, and it's mentioned that some of the elf sort of bardic magic involves making you see the things that they are singing about, which is something that they never really get into elsewhere. This could be a bit of editorializing by Faramir's grandson who wrote the story in universe, or it could just be something that Tolkien threw in there to be cute. There you have it. I think the most interesting thing, though, is what Elrond thinks of when he sees Aragorn, who has just turned 20. And it says, Elrond looked at him and was pleased, for he saw that he was fair and noble, and was come early to manhood. And this is sort of interesting because you're thinking, well, he's 20 years old, and generally speaking, we're considered, human beings, mortal men, considered adults at the age of 18. Some would say 21, but especially as we go further back into the past, it was usually considered to be 18. The idea of becoming an adult at 21 is quite a more modern thought. But this is actually explained. It is due to the lifespan. And it's sort of like how hobbits are not considered adults until they turn 33, because hobbits, they don't live like 70 years like humans do. They live about 100 or so years. And dwarves, we never actually get a definitive answer on the dwarfish age of majority, so to speak. But there was a reason that Gimli, for example, was not included in The Hobbit, other than the obvious literary fact that the character was not yet created. He was created for the Lord of the Rings. But when he was created, and the fact that he was 139 years of age in the Lord of the Rings, and then we'd wonder, well, why wasn't he involved in any way in The Hobbit? And that's actually explained in one of those other stories that I mentioned, The Quest for Erebor, where Gimli notes to Gandalf and Frodo and Sam and Merry and Pippin, because those are all the characters that are gathered there telling the story, that at the age of I believe it was 62, he was considered too young to go on an adventure. So dwarves actually live about 250 years or so. So at the age of being in his 60s, he was still considered a boy. So Tolkien was very sort of interested in these sort of things of, if you have an extended lifespan, you have an extended childhood, you have an extended adolescence and such. And Aragorn is interesting because he looks at Arwen here he meets her for the first time, and he thinks that she's like sort of the same age as him. Of course, she's about 3,000 years old, which is still youngish, for an elf. And if you ever wonder, elves physically mature pretty quickly, but they're not fully mature until they reach 50 years of age, and even then, that's sort of the beginning of the teen years for them. They're considered full adults at the age of 100, but of course they're immortal. Their lifespan is infinite. Even if they die, they can and do come back, unless Nama Mandos says, no, you have to stay in Mandos. And even then, they're not really dead. They just don't get a body. They're just sort of like stuck in this cavernous area for a while, for however long Nama Mandos wills it. Because that is the one thing that he's fully in charge of. Not even Manwë can tell him what to do. I suppose that Ilúvatar could, because Ilúvatar is God, but Ilúvatar left the Valar in charge of the earth, so he would probably not intervene on anyone's behalf, other than the examples of Lúthien and Tuor. And of course, that's a whole other thing to talk about, Lúthien and Tuor. But anyway, we're going to get to your questions. I finally get to read a bit of that. Maybe we'll come back and read the rest at some point. Well, certainly I'll be doing it on Twitch at some point. But anyway, let's move on to the first question. Here we go. Okay, so our first question is actually, like I mentioned earlier, it is an AI question, and I wanted to sort of highlight this. Why did elvish rulers prefer lord and lady over king and queen? So this is not really true as a rule. Elves have kings, and they have queens, and even high kings. The example of lords and ladies is like Elrond, Celebrian, Celeborn, and Galadriel. And so I wanted to talk about this because I wanted to talk a little bit about how the AI works on Quora and how it's sort of a source of personal frustration for me, and how this came about as well. And also I realized, because I'm sort of dipping into this again of the lines of kings and everything, that I never mentioned. I was talking in the intro about the ages of majority, and I was trying to get to the point of the men of Numenor becoming adults at 25, and I sort of just went off on a tangent and never got there, so there it is. So anyway, this is the way it happened that we come to this question. Earlier in the week, I pointed out in an answer that I was writing on Quora to a real person that Celeborn and Galadriel largely rejected being called the king and the queen of Lothlorien. They prefer to be called the lord and the lady. I also pointed out that this was also true of Elrond, and by extension, his wife Celebrian. I did explain why in this instance, but AI, it could read, but it doesn't always understand things. It just does what AI always does. It regurgitates things. So it generated a question based on my observation because it was something that got a lot of views, and a lot of times it'll sort of find a little thing in there and it'll be like, okay, follow-up question, but I'm a robot. And it can be kind of strange. So it generated a question based on this observation. It actually targeted it directly at me because the AI can tag you just like people can. It happens a little bit differently. It comes through as like a push notification on my phone. It's fascinating on a technological level. It's frustrating on a lot of levels because a lot of times these are nonsense questions. But it gives me the opportunity to spin off this aside into a grander point. But like AI usually does, it makes a sweeping generalization, thinking that, well, elves just didn't have kings and queens. Why is that? But that's not really the case. Elves have kings. They have high kings. And those kings, when wed, have queens. They do not have ruling queens. They have what we would call a queen consort. It seems the only culture in the entirety of Arda that specifically was mentioned to allow women to rule alone was Numenor. And that wasn't even at first. That was after Tar Aldarion changed the rules so that his daughter could become queen after he had given up the throne rather than his cousin, who he really did not want to become the king of Numenor. And it was kind of hinted that Rohan might allow a queen. I think definitely if Éomer had passed in the Return of the King, they certainly would have accepted Éowyn as their queen. But anyway, there are oodles of elven kings. The primary king of the elves is Ingva. He's also the king of the Vanyar. And the Noldor and the Teleri have kings of their own. The Noldor even split their kingship between the Undying Lands, where they have Finarfin as the king of the Noldor. And Middle-earth, they had a line of high kings of the Noldor of Middle-earth. Most of them didn't last very long. The longest lasting one was Gil-galad, and then he died, and there were no Noldor kings in Middle-earth after that. Even in The Hobbit, when we're introduced to the elves of the Woodland Realm in Mirkwood, there is a king. He's called the Elven King, or he's just called the King. His name is actually Thranduil, but it doesn't mention his name directly in The Hobbit. They mention his name in The Lord of the Rings. They mention Gil-galad in The Lord of the Rings. Galadriel allows people to refer to her as queen without correcting them. She's just very polite. She doesn't think of herself as a queen. So the question isn't why do elvish rulers not call themselves king or queen, but why specifically do Elrond and Celebrian not call themselves king and queen, and why do Celeborn and Galadriel not call themselves king or queen? And the answer is actually very simple. Words mean things, especially when the author is a philologist. King has a precise meaning, and the title is given to someone who either creates a kingdom or inherits that title by blood or by conquest. In the case of Elrond, and by extension his wife Celebrian, he did establish Imladris, or Rivendell, but it wasn't a kingdom. It was rather a part of the greater realm of Lindon, and he was the Lord of Imladris. Similarly, Eregion was founded by Celebrimbor. He was not the king, he was the lord of Eregion. It was part of Gil-galad's realm as well. So Celebrimbor was the lord of Eregion. Círdan was not a king. He took over Lindon, but he did not inherit the title of king from Gil-galad. He was older than Gil-galad, but he wasn't Noldor. He was Sindar. So he couldn't really become king of the Noldor. So Círdan is the lord of Lindon in the Third Age. Gil-galad had no direct heirs. He had no indirect heirs other than Galadriel. And as the Noldor did not accept female rulers, and she was quite uninterested anyway, Gil-galad was succeeded by absolutely no one. There weren't enough Noldor left in Middle-earth to bother with a kingdom anyway. Most of them were now in the Undying Lands, ruled by Finarfin. Galadriel did set out to Middle-earth specifically with the idea of founding and ruling a fair kingdom of her own, But she never actually did this. She tooled around in Doriath. She married Celeborn. They departed over the Misty Mountains before the fall of Beleriand. They wound up in Lothlorien. But this land already had a king, a guy named Amroth. And Amroth died childless and thus passed to the Undying Lands and left his people with no ruler. And they were happy to accept the rule of Celeborn and Galadriel, but as they did not found the realm, they weren't the king and the queen, but rather they were the lord and the lady, though they accepted that many would assume that they were the king and the queen, and they took it all in stride. Of course, Celeborn and Galadriel could have just declared themselves king and queen, and I don't think the Sylvan subjects would have disliked this. The Sylvan subjects of Mirkwood gladly accepted Sindar kings Orifer and his son Thranduil, but they already ruled. What did the title matter to them? Orifer did not take over an already existing kingdom. Rather, he founded one, and the Sylvan elves who already lived there accepted him. But in the case of Lothlorien, it was already a kingdom whose line of kings has ended. So I hope that clears that up and gives you a little bit of insight about how writing prompts work on Quora. Like I said, I'm working a little bit with the Quora people to try and improve it. We'll see. We'll see if it happens. Personally, I don't think it's going to improve. I don't have good hopes for this, but they want my feedback. I'm certainly willing to give it to them. I don't think it's going to work, but we'll see. Let's move on to your next question. Our next question comes in by the request of Nate Lee, who asks, in Three's Company, Gandalf tells Frodo that he has heard something that has made him anxious. What did he hear? Is this ever followed up on? I think Mr. Roper was on to him. He'd been staying with Frodo under false pretenses, and there was a hilarious mix-up based on mistaken identity. Okay, I'm kidding. Obviously, I'm joking there. The chapter of the title is actually Three is Company. Three's Company was a pretty low-tier sitcom. Gandalf mentions being anxious twice in this chapter. The first time, he merely states that he is anxious, but the second time, which is what you're talking about here, and it's actually 2 months later, he mentions that he had heard something that made him anxious. He says that he will leave and then he will return immediately, or at the very least, he will send word. He did not return, nor did he seem to send word, prompting Frodo to wait longer than he should have. Gandalf actually did send word, but Barlaman in Bree forgot to send the letter urging Frodo to leave as early as he could. This was because on his way back he ran into Radagast the Brown, who told him that Saruman the White was looking for him urgently, and then he got caught up with that for quite a while. So what did Gandalf hear that made him so nervous, and who was it that he spoke to? Let's answer the second part first. He spoke to Aragorn at a place called Sarn Ford. That's the southern border of the Shire. Aragorn and his rangers had been keeping an eye on the Shire for quite a while, and this was actually Gandalf's idea for them to do that, and Gandalf went to check with them. We learn this from Aragorn himself in a later chapter, which is just called Strider. What did he learn? 2 disturbing things, both of which he spills the beans about in the chapter The Council of Elrond. The first was disturbing news about war in the south, and the second was a black shadow. The first part refers to the fall of Osgiliath, which was at some point the capital of Gondor. Of course, now it becomes Minas Tirith. The second part, the Black Shadow, this is referring to the Black Breath, which is a device of the Nazgûl, which can poison others with their breath, sapping their will to fight. Sauron taking Osgiliath is a huge blow in the south, and the use of such magic was troubling, and Gandalf had to go see if these reports were true, and likely also confer with other members of the Wise, such as Elrond and Galadriel. He would, of course, have made it back in time to guide Frodo, if not for Saruman's trap, and even then, he still would have gotten word to Frodo, if not for Barlaman's forgetfulness. Okay, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in from Etienne G. I hope I'm saying that right. Why were the Dead Men of Dunharrow cursed to an eternal afterlife until Aragorn freed them? Could anyone breaking oath end up as a cursed spirit, or did Isildur somehow damn them via the power of the One Ring, intentionally or not? So anyone who makes an oath with a capital O can find themselves in this sort of predicament. Anyone can swear an oath with a lowercase o and break the oath and face no consequences outside of the social consequences that come with breaking promises. However, when it's an oath with a capital O, it is a divine promise made before God, who is called Iluvatar in this world, and he does not allow people to take his name in vain. Thus, those who swear by the One, referring to Iluvatar, not to the ring, will be physically, mentally, and spiritually compelled to fulfill that oath. The Dead Men of Dunharrow thus were cursed, not by Isildur, but by Iluvatar, essentially by themselves, to be denied the gift of man, which is death and passing from the world, until their oath was fulfilled. We see a similar thing in the Silmarillion when Feanor and his sons, they all take an oath, capital O, and even as his surviving sons come to regret taking this oath and they wish to stop all the murder and the mayhem associated with it, they swore an oath for the One, and it gnawed at them, and it forced them to carry out this oath by any means, because that's what the oath was, that they would retrieve the Silmarils by any means, and that anyone who stood in their way, no matter who it was, would be killed. And they had to understand the consequences of such a thing. It's a harsh lesson indeed. Isildur did not have the power to deny the gift of man, nor could he have been using the One Ring. He did not possess the One Ring at this time. Remember, he was going out to battle against Sauron. He had the One Ring after Sauron was defeated. Sauron did have the power to anchor men to the world and deny them the gift of man and to make them wraiths, but that's necromancy. He is a necromancer. Isildur is not. So this wasn't actually necromancy in this sense. It was Iluvatar saying, if you made an oath, I'm going to force you to do it, and you will not be allowed to die and pass from the world and come to be in the timeless halls with me until you fulfill your oath. And that may take forever. Or thankfully, they were able to do it. They listened to Aragorn. They chased off the Corsairs of Umbar, and then they passed from the world. Okay. All right, let's move on to the next question. Here's another question that comes in from Etienne G, who asks, aside from turning you invisible, rather moving you into the Shadow Realm, and its corrupting influence, what can the One Ring do? Could one of the Fellowship put it on and command orcs, or even the Nazgûl, for example? The primary function of the One Ring is indeed the domination of others, but this doesn't mean that any of the Nine Walkers could wear it and start commanding anyone, even orcs. The One Ring is made for Sauron, and Sauron alone. He can use it to dominate others, but it is not his only tool to dominate others. Note that during the Lord of the Rings, Sauron never possesses the One Ring, and yet he is able to dominate the orcs. Once the ring is destroyed, the orcs lose their direction. But this is not because the ring was commanding them. It's because Sauron's power, a lot of it was tied up in the ring, and that power was commanding them. He was able to use his power, even if it was physically separated from him by the ring not being there. He couldn't access the specific things the ring could do for him, however. But so much of his power was in the ring that once it was destroyed, he became too weak to keep control of his armies. It's a common misconception that having lost the ring weakened Sauron. It's not true. What is true is more that the ring empowered him, and having lost it, he lost an edge that he had. He was still, as Tolkien puts it, in rapport with his own power that is housed in the ring. That being said, the unmaking of the One Ring did permanently destroy a lot of his power. The greater part of his power was the exact wording that Tolkien used. This made him too weak to control his armies, too weak to keep his tower together, too weak to keep his body together, too weak to really do anything. So could another take up the One and become like Sauron? Could somebody become the Lord of the Rings? Yes, we are told this at several points by Gandalf in Bag End, by Elrond in Rivendell, and by Galadriel in Lothlorien. Gandalf specifies that only one who already has great power can wield the One Ring. He can, and it is likely that so could any wizard. or certain elf lords like Glorfindel. However, Galadriel gives us a greater scope of what that means. She tells Frodo that if he was to use the ring to dominate others, he must not only become vastly more powerful, but also train his mind in the dominion of others. One cannot easily imagine Frodo desiring to dominate the minds of others, and Tolkien means for us to understand that such a thing is wholly evil. Gandalf stated that he did not trust himself with the ring. He said this to Frodo, he said it to Denethor. He would find a reason to use it for good. But he was wise enough to know that such a thing could not be used for good. To become the Lord of the Rings is to become as Sauron is, and while this would give one domination over the Nazgûl, permanently bound to the One, and anyone who continues to wear a ring of power while there is a Lord of the Rings, this doesn't give them automatic domination over random orcs. Being the biggest and the most evil power in the vicinity would do that just fine. Okay, next question. Our next question comes in anonymously, and it's an interesting one. I tend to stick to just Tolkien, but sometimes I'm asked things that are a bit more broad, and I find a way to sort of bring Tolkien into it, because that's what I do. But this person asks me, what fictional universe would you most like to live in, and why? And this is interesting, because I think a lot of people who know me sort of would assume that I would say Arda, or more specifically Middle-earth. And I would absolutely love to explore the world of Arda and the realm of Middle-earth from the holodeck aboard the Starship Enterprise. The thing about living in fictional worlds is the reason that these worlds, whether it's the Lord of the Rings or whatever, the reason that these worlds are so exciting to read about, or to watch films about, or to watch television shows about, or plays or video games or whatever else you can think of, but the reason that it's exciting is the danger presented. The real world is dangerous, there's no doubt about that. And some fictional worlds are far more dangerous to live in than the real world, and some are less so. Middle-earth, Arda, that would fall far on the more dangerous scale, unless I'm, I've parked myself in a place that's like Rivendell or Lindon, and never ventured outside these bounds. And then I would wonder, well, what part of the story am I in? Is it the Fourth Age? Or, I would hope not, because then, they're not as special. There's really not many elves there. So, but if I found myself in a really, really safe place and never left, that would get boring after a while. And I would probably, be on the orc menu. So I'd take the more optimistic, futurist idea of Star Trek, with its sort of post-scarcity utopia. Every once in a while, the Romulans are going to do something, or there's a war. But that's just like real life, I would say that Star Trek is probably a little less dangerous than the real world. And maybe sometimes the holodeck malfunctions, and, Mark Twain takes you hostage. But, you got to take the good with the bad. But I could go in and I could say, I want to see Rivendell, or I could go to the most dangerous places. I could say, I want to see Angband, I want to see Mordor, I want to see the Undying Lands. That would be amazing, right? There would be no way if I lived in Middle-earth that I would ever get to see the Undying Lands. But if I was in a holodeck, then I think I could make that happen, right? So that's interesting. I've actually gotten this question quite a few times, and I always say, I would love to visit Middle-earth if it was on the holodeck, because who wants to get hit by a stray arrow, or have an orc cut your head off, or get carried away by an eagle or something? Absolutely no fun at all. Okay, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in from Link of Wise, who asks, if Gandalf considered Radagast and the Blue Wizards his brothers, why did he not try to find them so that he could go as a family into the West once Sauron was defeated? There's your thing. He didn't consider these guys to be his brothers any more than you may consider your coworkers to be your brothers. The five wizards have a very long history of working together, but Gandalf, as well as the rest of them, doesn't remember much of that very well. Manwë and the rest of the Valar wanted the Astari, that's the wizards, to be unburdened by memory and to stay on mission. Gandalf's mission did not include making sure that the rest got back. That was up to them. Note that Gandalf isn't even willing to sort out the Shire before he left, though this was a good thing. The Shire folk needed to be able to defend their own borders. The Blue Wizards were beyond his reach, and Radagast had also pulled a disappearing act, and Gandalf now had the sea longing, essentially the unquiet of Ulmo. When the wizards fulfilled their mission, which Gandalf was the only one that really did, they would become filled with the overwhelming urge to go home. Now, Gandalf did still linger for a little while. He spoke with Bombadil, and he was able to set Frodo and Bilbo's affairs in order, and then he departed, as he was meant to. Okay, next question. And this week our thumbnail question comes in from Andrew M., who asks, why did Sauron take away the 9 rings of men from the Nazgûl and hold on to them instead of allowing them to wear the rings? Now, this is very, very interesting. While we know, and I use that in quotes, that he took the rings back from the Nazgûl at some point, we don't actually know when that happened. And actually, we really don't even know if that happened. It's actually in question. It's a commonly held belief that Sauron took the 9 back from the Nazgûl. Gandalf tells Frodo in Book 1 that the Dork Lord has gathered the 9 to himself. We can interpret this as meaning that he actually took the rings from them, or we could interpret it that he just has control over the 9, over their bearers fully. Similarly, Galadriel makes a reference to this idea after Frodo sees the Eye of Sauron in the Mirror of Galadriel. She says that Frodo has seen the eye of he who holds the 7 and the 9. Now, this seems way more clear-cut. Sauron holds the 9, exact wording. But we can still call this into question a bit. She mentions the 7. He certainly has all of them that exist in Middle-earth, which amounts to 3. 4 have been destroyed completely. Galadriel likely knows this, so she just might be speaking poetically here. She holds the remaining rings that were of the 7. The most explicit reference to this idea that Sauron took the rings back from the Nazgûl is not actually found in The Lord of the Rings, but in Unfinished Tales, and specifically in a story that I've mentioned earlier, The Hunt for the Ring. It's basically a part of The Lord of the Rings that just didn't make it into the main text. Furthermore, this reference, which states they were entirely enslaved to their 9 rings, which he now himself held, is not part of the most complete version of this story, the one that is presented as, and I'm going to use quotes again, canon, but rather it's from version B, which agrees very largely with version A in its narrative structure, with small differences. The mention of Sauron holding the 9 being one of them. In other words, there were 4 versions of the story, The Hunt for the Ring, and the version that Christopher Tolkien chose to present as the most complete one did not contain this reference. But we do have 2 references to Sauron holding the rings that made it into The Lord of the Rings, even if one of them is a little shaky. Why would we bother saying that this is contested, that this is questionable? Because in the Council of Elrond chapter, Gandalf says something very interesting. I'm going to read you a small paragraph. Some Galdor, said Gandalf, would think that the tidings of Gloin and the pursuit of Frodo proof enough that the halfling's trove is a thing of great worth to the enemy. Yet it is a ring. What then? The 9 the Nazgûl keep. The 7 are taken or destroyed. At this Gloin arrived? I'm sorry. At this Gloin stirred but did not speak. The 3 we know of. What then is this one he desires so much? So in this statement, Gandalf states that the Nazgûl themselves keep the rings. Now, we might stretch the definition of the word keep to mean that they keep guard over it, but that's not likely to be true, because if they were in the Dark Tower and the Nazgûl were guarding them, Gandalf knows that this is no longer the case, because the Nazgûl are out and about. He fought some of them at Weathertop, and he assisted Elrond with the spell that washed all 9 of them away, or I should say washed 3 of them away, and then Glorfindel pushed the other 6 into the flood. So it seems that what we have here is a difference of opinion between 2 of the wise. Gandalf stated at one point that Sauron holds the 9, but he either realized his error after facing the Nazgûl, or he might have been right, but then the Nazgûl were allowed to take the rings with them when they set out of Mordor, and Gandalf might have realized this. Or he was only meaning that he held the devotion of the bearers. He, at this point, holds the opinion that the Nazgûl actually have possession of these rings. Galadriel is of the opinion that Sauron holds them. They are, of course, allowed to have this disagreement, as Gandalf is allowed to change his opinions when presented with new information. All this to say that Sauron might not actually have the 9 rings in his physical possession. He has them certainly in his spiritual possession, because he's the Lord of the Rings, but he might not have them physically. But let's say he does. Then you might ask the question again, why isn't he creating more Nazgûl? Why doesn't he give them to another 9 men and have even more of these servants? Well, we don't know if that's actually possible, as the 9 are permanently bound to their rings, and therefore to the one. It may be theoretically possible that the rings are symbiotically also bound to the Nazgûl, and they may not have other hosts. Even if it was possible to have other hosts, it takes centuries for the process to happen, and Sauron was very picky with the 9. He made sure to pick only men that would be amenable to his will. His failures with the elves and the dwarves taught him that lesson. If he possesses the 9, then he has 12 rings total, 3 of which absolutely were never bound to anybody. The dwarves were affected by the rings, but they were resistant to Sauron's actual control. So why couldn't he use those? He doesn't have the One Ring. That's the main thing. The Nazgûl did not appear until pretty late in the Second Age, and the war was already going. He didn't have a lot of time to cultivate more Nazgûl, if this was even possible. And after the Second Age, he no longer had the One Ring to bind them. The One is absolutely necessary to control the wills of ring bearers. If Sauron could command them without the One Ring, then he could have commanded Elrond, or he could have commanded Círdan, or could have commanded Galadriel, or he could have commanded Gandalf when they wore their rings. So that's basically the answer there, is that he might not have actually had those rings, and even if he did, and he did give them out to people, he couldn't actually make more Nazgûl and control them directly without the One Ring to rule them all. Okay, let's move on to the next question. Here is a question that comes in from Avery Goodman, who asks, were the Return of the King's extensive appendices present in the first published edition, and if so, have they been changed at all since then? So the appendices were actually always included. If you look at the original publication dates, you might find it curious that both the Fellowship of the Ring and the Two Towers were released in the same year, in 1954, and then the Return of the King came out the next year, in 1955. As the entire thing was meant to be one work, and was only split into volumes to essentially to save money, it seems odd that the two would come out in the same year and then the third, but the appendices were actually the reason that the Return of the King was delayed. Tolkien agonized over what to include and what not to include, and space was at a premium. At one point, he even considered sacrificing some of the appendix materials to make room for a longer index. This never happened. Also not included are, and we mentioned these a few times, the supplementary stories, The Quest for Erebor and The Hunt for the Ring, which were later included in Unfinished Tales. The only version of The Return of the King that didn't include all of the appendices was the first official paperback. There were some bootleg paperbacks before that. And this was because it would have been a massive cost. It would not be very cost effective at all to include them. And Tolkien actually agreed with this, but he did insist that they include the Tale of Aragorn and Arwen in that version. There were changes to the later versions in both the main text and the appendix, but they were mostly just little errors, taking out typos and sort of like formatting issues and things like that. Nothing too major. It's not like The Hobbit, where he completely changed one of the chapters. Okay, move on to the next question. Our next question comes in from Evan Carroll, and this is sort of a different sort of question. Why were Middle-earth movies always released in December? So this is true for the most part. Out of the 7 theatrically released, at least so far 7 theatrically released films based on Middle-earth, 6 of them were released in December. There's one caveat in there. The exception is that The Lord of the Rings, the 1978 animated film made by Ralph Bakshi, was actually released in November. And it was not even released in the UK until the following July. The caveat of the 6 Peter Jackson films is that The Hobbit and Unexpected Journey had an early premiere in late November before its later worldwide release. However, in every other instance, these films did come out in December. Even The Lord of the Rings, War of the Rohirrim, which is coming out this month in December, it's December 2024 right now, though this was a delay caused by the SAG-AFTRA strike, the film was initially set to come out in April. The reasoning is simply that large budget films with an expected high box office that don't exactly fall into the summer blockbuster category are almost always released around Christmas. The Christmas season, therefore, sees a lot of fantasy releases. A December release usually suggests that the studio has a high hope of a good box office return, but they don't feel it's a summer film. The War of the Rohirrim was originally going to come out in April, and that's curious. It suggests that it was going to be part of this sort of ongoing trend of the early summer films and expanding, and now April is early summer. And we see this more and more every year. It lessened a bit during COVID because there weren't as many theatrical releases during that, but it's gone back to the way it was, of course. Studios all are sort of jockeying for position to be the first to kick off the summer movie season. However, the strike, moving it to Christmas, makes it more in line with the rest of the Middle-earth releases. And at this point, it just feels traditional, I guess. And I would assume that The Hunt for Gollum will be in, a December release as well. And I'm assuming that New Line Cinema is going to make more of them after that. So there you have it. I guess it's not New Line anymore, is it? But I assume that they're going to continue to make more Middle-earth films, whatever they may be, and that they're going to be released in December because it just feels like a tradition at this point. Okay, next question. Our next question comes in from Thomas Olson, who asks, where is Maglor chilling after hucking his Silmaril into the sea? And maybe, just maybe, is he that elf we see at Aragorn's wedding at the end of The Return of the King? I love the wording of this, that he where is he chilling? He hucked his Silmaril into the sea. So he's actually in Mandos with the rest of his brothers and his father. The Silmarillion makes Maglor's fate ambiguous, with only legend tells that he wanders the shores of Middle-earth singing of his misdeeds. However, in letter 131, Tolkien spills the beans about what actually happened to Maglor. I'm going to read you an excerpt from that letter. The last 2 sons of Feanor, compelled by their oath, steal them and are destroyed by them, casting themselves into the sea and into the pits of the earth. The ship of the Arundel, adorned with the last Silmaril, is set in heaven as the brightest star. So ends the Silmarillion and the tales of the first age. Though the final published version of the Silmarillion did not contain the note that Maglor actually cast himself into the sea, this is likely because Tolkien didn't actually write that part yet. He died, and it was released after he died in an unfinished state. His son did his best to cobble it together. The Silmarillion is the history also as the elves see it. They believe that he's still out there. I do think it's very creative to decide that elf is Maglor. Obviously, Peter Jackson didn't have any sort of rights to the Silmarillion. That elf, the blonde elf that's with Elrond at the wedding in the Return of the King film version, doesn't have a name. And some people have said, well, that's Glorfindel, but it's never said to be Glorfindel. And then some people have had some other ideas, obviously. And he just might have been just a random nameless elf. There actually was a random nameless elf in the first film who wound up going by the name Figwit which stood for Frodo is great, who is that? And because they started calling him Figwit, and he was just sort of this striking character, he wound up getting expanded scenes in the Two Towers and the Return of the King. But yeah, a lot of people like, oh, who is that guy? It is sort of like another like Figwit, except it's Aragorn is great. Who is that? You could sit there and say, well, maybe it's Maglor. He's still out there somehow and everything. But I would say no, because Maglor wouldn't be blonde like that. Feanor's sons would either have dark hair or they would have red hair. So there's that. Okay, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in from Hal Santos, who asks, if Durin somehow was able to know about the Balrog before it awakened, could the Dwarf Kingdom have defeated it? Well, I suppose that if they knew about the Balrog, they wouldn't have gone and woken it up, now would they? If Durin VI had suddenly discovered that there was a Balrog under his city, and that it had been there since the fall of Morgoth, he would certainly not wish to battle it. Balrogs can be defeated. Glorfindel did it, Ecthelion did it, and Gandalf would later do it. It's reasonable that a well-prepared, large contingent of dwarves, not taken by surprise, can do it, but at a fantastic loss of life. That isn't to say that Durin VI would be smart to just let it sit there. It might eventually wake up with no help from him or his people, and then it would have to be dealt with. The smart move for him would have been to seek out friends among the elves, the close friends of the dwarves, Lord Celebrimbor and the people of Rhegion. They were gone at this point, and the doors of Durin were shut. Lord Celeborn didn't much care for dwarves, though his wife, Lady Galadriel, was more amenable. King Thranduil would be absolutely no help, but who would be a big help would be Elrond. So if Elrond were made aware of the Balrog at this time in the Third Age, he would call Gandalf and Galadriel and Saruman together and the rest of the White Council, and that's how the Balrog would be faced. Of course, if this happens, it sort of drastically ruins the story of the Lord of the Rings, but that's what these sort of questions do. They just take the story in a completely different direction, and at that point, I would just say, hey, why not write a fan fiction then? At that point, maybe it would wind up being really good. Okay, let's move on to the next question. Here is a question that comes in from the Enlightened, and I'm actually planning on expanding this into a whole discussion topic during the next Council of Tolkien meeting. Which character in the Lord of the Rings movies was written with the most respect to the original version in Tolkien's books? And this is interesting because I thought about this long and hard, and I came up with a bunch of different answers and sort of striking out names in my mind, and it really just came down to Sam. It's Sam. In the instances of serious deviations from the book in terms of Sam in the films, it was never that Sam was out of character. It was that Frodo was out of character, or it was that Faramir was out of character. Sam's movie version was lifted almost directly off the page. The only critique that I may come up with was that, Sam in the book wasn't quite so mean to Smeagol. He distrusted Smeagol, and he voiced his distrust to Frodo, who agreed with Sam. But Frodo in the book had sort of this attitude of, well, what other choice do we have? At the least, the movie version of Sam did try to make amends with Smeagol as they got released from Osgiliath, so there is that. Gandalf is a close second. I think that the book Gandalf is made of sterner stuff. There were some changes to Gandalf that I actually appreciated, such as telling Pippin what happens when you die. In the book, the conversation was actually with Aragorn, and Gandalf was very, very vague about it. I would also give respect to the portrayal of Saruman, though his part is much smaller in the films. A lot of the scenes from the books didn't wind up in the film at all, but they did a good job with him. But I have to say, the one that was the most respectful portrayal was definitely Sam, and due in no small part to Sean Astin just doing a fantastic job in that role as well. Okay, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in from Francis Corden, who asks, when we talk about the years of the Third Age and the Fourth Age, etc., what calendar is that in story? Thank you. There's actually 4 relevant calendars that we could talk about here. The first calendar that we could speak of is called the King's Reckoning, which is essentially the calendar that was used in Numenor, and then it was used later in Gondor and Arnor. In this calendar, there are 12 months called Nivinya, Nemine, Sulime, Virse, Lotessa, Naria, Kermia, Urima, Yavania, Narquelia, Hissima, and Ringara. All of these months had 30 days. The only exception was Kermia, which had 31 days. So this doesn't actually add up to a full year, but there were several holidays that were not part of any month. There was Yestera, which was the New Year. There was Loenda, which was the mid-year day, and there was Matara, which was the end of the year. And eventually there was a second mid-year day that was added, a sort of a leap year solution, and they were those mid-year days were called the Enderi. So this still didn't add up to a full year, though, so there were other sort of leap year type solutions that were added. You could tell this calendar is a mess. If they tried changing the mid-year to 2 days, eventually the difference was still so confusing, and the entire system wound up being replaced by a new calendar, which was called the Steward's Reckoning. So the names of the months were mostly the same. There was one exception. Nivinya became Narvinya. All of the days now had 30 days, and there were 2 extra non-month holidays, days that were on their own, not part of any month. There was Tulire in the spring and Yavire in the fall. And on that, of course, there was the other holidays that were all related there. However, this was fine for Gondor, but Arnor no longer really existed at this point. And some of the lands, most notably the Shire and Bree land, wished to keep the old calendar, which became known as the Shire Reckoning. Although in true Hobbit fashion, they changed it, of course, and they made it more to their liking. They renamed all the months, and they reworked it over time. So the Shire Reckoning eventually wound up with 12 months that all had 30 days, and then 5 additional days that were holidays that made it a full year, 365 days, and they sort of had leap years as well during various months. So the Shire Reckoning renamed the months. They became After Yule, Solmarth, Wreath, Astron, Thermage, Forlith, Afterlith, Wedmouth, Halamuth, Winterfilth, Blotmarth, and Foryule. The holidays were Second Yule, First Lith, Mid-Year's Day, Second Lith, and First Yule. The leap year day was sometimes inserted into a month that would make it 31 days, but other times it was a holiday called Overlith, which was wedged between the Mid-Year's Day and the Second Lith. So lastly, you did mention the Fourth Age, so there's another calendar to talk about, which was called New Reckoning, which was Aragorn the Second Elgelsorn's new calendar, which almost all of Middle-earth adopted, except for the Shire. The Shire kept their calendar, the Shire Reckoning. The years also differed, not just the way that they reckoned the months and everything, because there was actually a difference of opinion over when the Fourth Age actually started. Some said that the end of the Third Age was the fall of Sauron, and some others said it was Lord Elrond sailing to the west, so we kind of have 2 different year systems at this point. Aragorn's new calendar was very radical. Started the new year on the anniversary of the destruction of the One Ring, making the New Year holiday Yestara happen during the Shire's 25th of Wreath. And the end year holiday, Matara, was during the 24th of Wreath. So to put it in simple terms, Gondor's New Year was happening during the Shire's equivalent to March. The New Reckoning kept the same names of the months, just in a different order. So it was now Virose was the first month and Sulima was the last. The basic fact of this is that it's like somebody declared that New Year's was April 1st. And that's, of course, Tolkien's very cheeky April Fool's reference. We would understand that this would eventually be replaced by the more familiar Gregorian calendar, with the ones that kept the old ways being called April Fools. The only other big difference in Aragorn's calendar was that he made a new holiday called Cormara, which doubled as a leap year. Some years it was a leap year, its own thing, and sometimes it was just the last day of Yavania. It was also called Cormara. And this was actually, Cormara means ring day. It was actually Frodo's birthday. Okay, let's move on to the last question. Our final question comes in from Nasagak. I hope I'm saying that right. I don't know if maybe it's meant to be Nasagac. I don't know. We know Aragorn is honorable even as a fighter, but is he capable of adapting and fighting against dirty fighters, like those people who prefer using trickery and backstabbing? Yeah, of course. His decades of experience doing this says yes. I honestly think it's a strange question, if I'm being honest, to ask if Aragorn, of all people, can deal with underhanded foes, because that's essentially all he does. At the time that Frodo first meets him as Strider in The Prancing Pony, Aragorn is 87 years old. He is known as a Ranger of the North, which tells us that he's very experienced in things like hunting and trapping and tracking and survival. We aren't introduced to him as a warrior until later, but as we arrive in Rivendell, we are told that he is a Dunedain by Bilbo, a man of the West, Númenor. We learn later that he's not just any Dunedain, he is the chieftain of the Dunedain, the chieftain of the Rangers of the North, who has been protecting the Shire for many years. He carries a broken sword, but it hasn't really slowed him down, and sometime between the Council of Elrond and setting out with the Fellowship, he reforges the sword. We learn that he's been through Moria, and we learn that he is a capable leader, almost tireless in stamina, and with almost superhuman sight. You remember those scenes in the movies where Legolas would see very far? Those actually borrowed from Aragorn. He's perceptive, he's cunning, and he tricks Sauron into thinking he has the One Ring. I'd say that's more than enough to say he could deal with trickery. He could also deal it out himself. Of course, the Palantir conversation was not exactly combat, but let's look at the appendix. We learn from the appendix in The Return of the King that a great warrior named Thorongil came to serve in the armies of both Gondor and Rohan, and that he was beloved and courageous and a natural leader and a force of nature in battle. Pretty much the only person that didn't care for Thorongil was Denethor II, who estimated him to be an agent of Mithrandir, that's Gandalf, who he believed wished to gain control of Gondor. The book doesn't outright say, and that man was Aragorn, but yeah, he was Aragorn. So the question is, who do we think Thorongil or Aragorn was fighting all those years? Honorable opponents who don't use trickery and deception? No, of course not. It was Sauron. And Aragorn tells us this right away when he meets Frodo, and his true nature is revealed by Gandalf's lost letter finally given to Frodo by Barlaam. I'm going to read you this relevant section from the chapter Strider. Frodo turned and looked at him thoughtfully, wondering about Gandalf's second postscript. "Why didn't you tell me that you were Gandalf's friend at once?" he asked. "It would have saved some time." "Would it? Would any of you have believed me until now?" said Strider. "I know nothing of this letter. For all I knew, I had to persuade you to trust me without proofs, if I was to help you. In any case, I did not intend to tell you about myself at once. I had to study you first and make sure of you. The enemy has set traps for me before now. As soon as I have made up my mind, I was ready to tell you whatever you asked, but I must admit," he added with a queer laugh, "that I hoped you would take me for my own sake. A hunted man sometimes wearies of distrust and longs for friendship, but there I believe my looks are against me." So Frodo and Sam and Merry and Pippin, they're distrustful of Strider at first, and Sam still is for a little while until Aragorn points out that if he wanted to harm him, he already would have. But this gives us another perspective. He was initially also distrustful of the hobbits. Now, while Sauron or Saruman may have set a trap for Frodo by using a fake Strider, so too may they have set a trap for Aragorn with a fake Frodo. And he specifically mentions that the enemy, that's Sauron in this case, because he doesn't know that Saruman is a traitor at this point, and it's capitalized, the enemy, has set traps for him before. So Aragorn comes to believe that the hobbits are genuine. just by simple observations of their words and their actions. But the fact is, he was on guard. He is ready for deception and trickery. He's on guard at all times. Being someone who has actively fought the enemy for over 6 decades will do that to a man, absolutely. So I'd have to say that there is no reason that we could cast Aragorn into this sort of bizarre thought that he's so honorable in combat that he couldn't deal with somebody using a dirty trick. He's used to dirty tricks. If he was that sort of guy, he would not have survived as long as he has, because he's 87 and has been fighting the good fight since he was 20. That section that I read you earlier in the intro, the tale of Arwen and Aragorn, he turned 20 and he meets Arwen. What happens after that? He goes to Elrond and he says, "Hey man, I'm in love with your daughter." And Elrond tells him, "You got to be worthy of her. If you want to marry her, you have to become the king." What does he do? He sets out right away. He goes into the wild, and he starts his work right away. And it takes him 67 years, well, 68 years actually, to become the king and finally marry her. But he does it. But I'm saying he wouldn't have survived if he was sort of too dumb to live, as is described here. Anyway, that was our final question. And I greatly enjoyed this week's episode, and I look forward to next week's episode. So send me lots of questions, leave me comments, hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't, share the video if you know anyone who might enjoy it, and I will see you guys next time.